Hello and welcome from Mexico City to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I have conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those with some connection to Latin America. This episode is brought to you by latamlist.com. If you like this podcast, you'll enjoy Latam List's daily tech news reporting. Sign up for the weekly mailing list to get updates. My guest today is Luis Garza, a Mexican entrepreneur based in Monterrey, who is founder of Kinedu, an app that provides educational games and activities that parents and kids can play together. We cover Luis's experience in the corporate world as a consultant, his experience living in the UK and the US, and how he ended up starting startups related to early childhood care and education in Mexico. Luis is the first Crossing Borders guest from Monterrey, so we cover what it's like starting a business there, raising money, and living in one of Mexico's most important business centers. We also covered Luis's first startup, Advenio, which provides high-quality childcare to preschool-age kids in Mexico. Luis shares his lessons learned about starting a startup, raising money, and why Mexico is an interesting market for entrepreneurs and investors to be thinking about. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Luis Garza. Hey, Luis, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Thank you, Nathan, for having me. It's a pleasure.
No, so happy to do it. Where are you in the world today?
I am sitting in our soon-to-be new offices in Monterrey, Mexico. I was looking at the open space right now, and it's just a bunch of open space with freshly painted walls. So it's an interesting spot to have this conversation.
That's a new chapter in the business. So tell me a little bit about Kinedu. What do you guys do?
Yeah, Kinedu encourages early childhood development at scale, and we do it through technology and content for adults. Essentially, what we want is to have parents, teachers spend more time playing with their kids, and we give them content and tools to help them understand how their child is doing. In this way, helping them attune to a greater degree and making sure that the activities are enjoyable for parents.
What are some of the most popular examples of courses or classes that people are taking?
So we do like minute to minute and a half video-based activity idea. So I wouldn't say that we have like a huge course. The program itself personalizes based upon what the child is learning, what the child likes, what you input as a child. We have this model that describes how development happens based on the responses of over 3 million parents, almost 3.5 million. And we process that data, created a model that describes early childhood development. And so I wouldn't say there's one popular because we have over 2,000 minute and a half long videos. But I would say that it's those videos that you do without any need for an app, like Peekaboo, any activity games like Peekaboo, hide and seek, running with your kids. There's very simple things that kids find very enjoyable. It's not very sophisticated to get a child to laugh and enjoy. So I'd say that's the secret is we do everyday activities, everyday videos, but we just help parents come up with these activities through the magic of software.
And where are most of the users located? In the Spanish-speaking world or worldwide?
No, surprisingly, 50% of our users or 45% of our users are from the United States and 20% of our users now are in Brazil. So about 70% are not Spanish-speaking. I would say 20% are Latin America and the rest of the 10% are scattered worldwide, UK, South Africa, random places where we never expected to be.
That's awesome. So I want to talk a little bit more about you and your story of how you got to starting the business first, then we'll jump back into getting more details on the business. But are you from Monterrey originally?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Monterrey all my life, except a couple of experiences I did abroad. When I was 10, I was sent to England. The security situation in Mexico wasn't very, very comforting for my parents, and they decided to ship me abroad for a year. So I was in a boarding school in a little town called Gilead. That's where I basically learned how to speak English. And then I stayed through high school and did college at Stanford University in the US. I did a management science and engineering degree. It was at that time where the tech bubble had just burst. So I started 2002. And it was funny because everybody, when everybody would want to get jobs during the summer or during the end of their tenure there, they would want to go to venture capital, private equity, banking, consulting. Nobody wanted to go to tech. And now all my friends and classmates who went to tech, some of them did really well. For example, Kevin Systrom, he graduated from my major, my class. Like he's also a management science engineer, 2006, and he did Instagram. So it's funny how at that time people weren't really fond of tech, and things turned around in 15 years. Amazing.
It really is amazing. And what was it like? What was it like going from Mexico to a year in the very, very north of England? What kind of culture shocks did you have?
So when I left Mexico, I didn't want to go. My parents would tell them that I would just send them letters and like, I don't like it here. It's cold. It's anything that you can imagine. When I came back, I didn't want to come back to Mexico. I was so happy in England that I just didn't want to come. So I think that the biggest culture shock is it's a totally different culture. Like even if you think about the culture shocks between the U.S. and Mexico, or what happened when I went to Stanford, etc., British and Mexicans, we're very opposite in many ways. And you've lived in Mexico, I guess, but you know that Mexicans are a little bit laid back. We're more family friendly. We're much less strict. We don't do well with schedules and timetables, etc. And then the UK, it's completely the opposite. Like the train leaves at 9 a.m., not 9:05, not 9:01. 9 a.m. the train has left. No. So I missed some trains a couple of times, but overall, it wasn't that hard because I was very young, and when you're young, you absorb everything. But I do remember that I didn't want to go, and I also didn't want to leave. So it was a transformational experience, I guess, and it was really the first time I was away from home for a long time without family, parents, etc. My brother was there at the same time, but that was the only family I had there.
So when you get to Stanford and start studying for your degree, did you know you wanted to get into tech, or did you think you were going to go more down a traditional career path?
No, I had no idea what I was doing. Like literally, like I didn't know any of what I wanted to do. I always tell people that one of my biggest regrets from being at Stanford was that I lived it on autopilot essentially. So I was just like coasting, enjoying, studying hard, and enjoying the parties, enjoying the lifestyle. California is great to live. Stanford was a very different town back then. Much less traffic, much less people. It was quainter and smaller, and it was really the farm, as they call it. But I lived in an autopilot, so I had to take 20 units a semester, and so I take my classes, and so a quarter, sorry, and so that I just went rolling. And if I could do it again, I would actually try to be more conscious of the opportunity and the privilege really that it is to go to Stanford and make the most of it. Really. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. So right after Stanford, I did management consulting in Mexico, mostly because my brother was doing management consulting. He was having a great time, like working really hard, but he was learning a lot. And I wanted to continue learning. I thought that I was still in my learning phase of life. And I just went to a management consulting, but it was really a non-conscious or non-very thought out decision. I just went there and then went to consulting. And still while I was at management consulting, it was an autopilot, doing the job, doing the project, and doing things well. I'm not saying mediocre ones, but really just coasting it. And then after management consulting, it's up or out. So every 2 or 3 years, you either go to an MBA or you're out. So I went to an MBA. So essentially, I lived the first 6 years after high school, Stanford and management consulting on autopilot. And it was at business school when I actually started to think about, well, what do I want to do with my life? And that's when I started to think. I got married during the first year, and I took my honeymoon. I took like a month off, so I didn't find a long-term job during that summer. But I knew that I knew two things when I was in business school. I was very conscious that I was fortunate, and that I wanted to help other people from Mexico be as fortunate and come to the US to study to Stanford and Harvard, etc. So I knew I wanted to come home. And I was very intrigued by what I've been learning about entrepreneurship and venture capital. My initial mindset was I want to be in venture capital because I want to help other people achieve their goals and come to the US also and study and be successful, whatever. But my frame of thought or my thought process was I need to learn how to be an entrepreneur in Mexico before I can help other entrepreneurs. So I decided to start looking for projects that people were starting. I had no ideas of my own, no good ideas, I thought. And I met the person who became my co-founder, or actually I became his co-founder for the company I built before Kinedu, which was Advenio. And Advenio is a childcare company. And I remember I sat down with him and he was telling me the story about what he was thinking about. And I told him, well, what do you need? Can I help you raise capital or can I connect you with people? He's like, no, I need somebody to help me do this company. And I'm like, you know what? I like to learn about entrepreneurship. So I'll help you with the business plan. I'll work while I'm at school. I'll take advantage of professors and the research. And by the end of my project, I'll give you a very well thought out pitch deck and business plan so you can raise capital. And he's like, cool. How much will that cost me? And I'm like, no, nothing. I'll do it for free because I want to learn. So we started off that. I started to fall in love with the project. I thought Rene Lancana is this person I'm talking about. He was very magical and passionate about what he wanted to do. And so I fell in love with the project, and he invited me on board after we raised our initial seed or pre-seed capital to start that company. And I decided to come on board. And so I really got in. That's how I got into entrepreneurship. And since then, I haven't left. I can't leave. It's just it sucks you in and doesn't let you go until you finish something amazing, I guess.
It sort of sounds like my Latin America experience, still here after a 6-month program 9 years later. But
Yeah.
what did Advenio do?
So Advenio essentially wants to reinvent how childcare is looked at in Latin America. And so we began by building daycare centers for companies, similar to the corporate sponsored model that Bright Horizons is doing in the United States and in the world, I guess. What the problem we had, a big problem we had, and a big advantage at the same time, it was a double-edged sword, was that a year before we started, there was the biggest tragedy in Mexico for childcare, which was Guardería ABC in Hermosillo. It burned down and 48 children died, and it was a government-run center, and it was terrible because it was all about government negligence in the best case, and in the worst case, corruption and intent. Um, it's not clear yet. The government didn't do a good job investigating, but after that happened, companies who were willing to put an initiative behind a CSR initiative or a philanthropic initiative on daycare centers abandoned their project. So we would go and talk to companies like Cemex, and Cemex would be like, "Yeah, we're really interested, but we don't want to do it now because of what happened, and kids will die." We're like, "Yes, yeah, they will die if you do a very, very, very shitty job at a daycare center." But in essence, it's a project that if you do a daycare right, it's low risk. If you have high quality teachers, if you have the right infrastructure, if you have the right learning program. So we started in that sort of essence in Mexico where nobody wanted to talk about it. It was highly needed because women were coming into the workplace very fast and leaving because they wanted to have families and had no options to come back. And companies weren't very family friendly. And so we brought in a model of guarderia that really turned on its head even the word guarderia, because guarderia in Spanish means a place where you store something, in this case, children. So we came in with a model, we call it corporate daycare. That's actually the actual words we use, no translations. And that model itself was built upon 4 pillars. It was a very high functional model for parents, which meant long hours from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. so parents could work, and parents who work in office spaces could work, take their children to the daycare center, etc. It was high functional in the sense that we provided cameras for parents to look at their children during the day. We set up the places very close to the offices, or even sometimes within the office buildings of the companies. We developed probably one of the first daycare center management software systems, cloud-based. So essentially what Brightwheel is doing in the US, we actually did in 2011 and have been building that and sophisticating that for 8 years for the childcare company. So that was pillar number 1. It's very high functional, very convenient for parents. Number 2 was incredible focus and perfection on safety standards. So that means fire sprinklers everywhere, we followed the NFPA, National Fire Protection Agency's code in the US. So any daycare center that you have that has our standards, that is ours, HSBC could run the same daycare center in Mexico, in Australia, and in New York because it has the same safety standards, the same safety procedures. It's number 2. Number 3, we really put a focus on learning. And so we changed the mindset from, guardando niños or just storing them to actually having a learning program from the moment they come in. And in Mexico, they start coming in at day 44 after birth because that's when maternity leaves end by government standards. And number 4 is highly trained teachers. And the highly trained teachers is everything that any daycare center would tell you. My teachers are very qualified, they're very trained, etc. We actually put a lot into retraining teachers because what we got from the market, had some areas of opportunity, and we wanted them very closely fine-tuned to the model that we were espousing. So those 4 things were really built and defined on the backs of, if I am HSBC, why would I hire you to run my daycare center? I have daycare centers in New York, I have daycare centers in Australia. Why would I have it in Mexico? And so by solving all of these problems, we literally turned the perception of companies regarding with daycare centers on its head. And that's how we started in 2010. And it was it sounds great now, 10 years later, it sounds like a brilliant idea. We opened up in October 2010 with 6 children in a 150 children centric capacity. So it wasn't the best start, but it was our first start, and that's how it got going.
What were some of the biggest lessons you learned over the 9 years in the business?
So I'll tell you a couple. One of them was that shit happens, and the reason why is October 2010. We had built one. We were operating with 6 children. We were signing the first initial company contracts. So we said, well, now we have a pipeline of 5 others, and so we built the next 5. And we were in the middle of building, and my co-founder calls me up and says, "Hey, I had to tell you something. I have cancer." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, I need to check myself, blah, blah, blah." So long story short, he's doing great. Um, but he had to step out of the business for 6 months. And so we were a very small team, and key person number one has to take 6 months. So I'm having to hold everything together for the next 6 months. We ran out of money. Everything happened. Like everything that can happen happened. We fortunately had great investors who were really supportive, who were really understanding of our naiveness and our inexperience, and we were able to get them to refund the business and continue operations. But I mean, you have to walk into entrepreneurship with a mindset of shit will happen, and if you're gonna blast or explode after the first small thing goes wrong, it's never gonna last. No? I would say that that's one of my biggest learning. The second one is that it's also a very human process, and the emotions that happen while building a company, the human relationships that you build, it's not transactional. If you live in the corporate world, it is very transactional. You go into a job, you leave 2 years later, you maybe made a friend and you leave. But when you're building a startup, you're very close or it doesn't work. And by that same line of thought, that very closeness makes departures so much harder. And it's really an effort of keeping those human relationships very close. I just had my CTO leave after 6 years, and it was a very hard process, but we had to let him go. He was going to Amazon Seattle. It was a great opportunity for him. But the way he handled the process of leaving in a very humane way towards me, towards the company, and I think vice versa, the company towards him, that just makes a total difference. And I think now we have an ally that's going to be an ally in Amazon for us forever, because we were very conscious of the humane way and the emotions on the way that we needed to be aware of and manage. And I think that's not something I had in my mind as very important in the very beginning, and I had to learn the bad way that we have to be conscious of emotions, both personal and third party emotions, and manage the relationships, take care of them, cultivate them. And it's you're building a team. You're not just building a product or a company.
So in the early 2010s in Monterrey, you were able to raise money for a business, and VC has changed massively over the next 8 or 9 years in Mexico. What was it like raising money back then for the business?
We found the right super angels, and I think that was the right investor for the company. We didn't try to raise angel cap VC investment in the very beginning. We did do some investor pitches later on, but once the business started to go along, the super angels just wanted to keep putting in more money, and eventually one of them actually took majority share of the company. It wasn't. I would say that it was a very different landscape in many ways, because in 2010 there was too few capital. There was not a lot of available capital, and as always, there's many entrepreneurial projects, and so that power dynamic shifted towards the venture capitalists, and so they would do whatever they wanted essentially. And you have some examples of companies very early on that just have very draconian terms on their term sheets, and that has changed, and it has changed for a couple of reasons. I think that the globalization of the tech revolution, it just came to Latin America. Like just the tech platforms available for tech, the iPhone, for example, itself wasn't available 10 years ago. There weren't a lot of people building companies. I don't think Rappi would have been able to be built 10 years ago, but now it's there. And so there's a lot of projects still. There's even a wider range. It's much less costly to start a company. And there are more funds, and companies, and some entrepreneurs that were successful early on now have their own funds and now are investing, and that's shifted the power dynamics to a more balanced state, I think. We in Kinedu, and we'll talk about that a little more, but we raised a small round last September, and the process was fantastic, and it was very balanced. I thought it was very fair. We had our disagreements with the lead investor, who was Ignia, but they're fantastic by the way. But it just got resolved because I think that my fears, knowing the venture capital landscape from 2012, 13, 14 versus the reality of today, is completely different. I had a very reasonable process, I had a very reasonable term sheet, and I just feel that it is friendlier now to start a company and try to raise capital and scale it. However, Latin American companies always have a higher bar than US companies. Like you see people in the US with a PowerPoint raising $10 million. That can never happen in Latin America. It's just, I mean, it may happen, but it's, I don't know. I think that our barrier to scale is higher than US entrepreneurs.
So I think you're the first entrepreneur from Monterrey on the podcast after 80 something. And that's pretty bad that it took 80 podcasts to get someone from one of the most important cities in Mexico onto the podcast. But tell me a little bit about what's the entrepreneurial ecosystem like? What's it like living in Monterrey? Kind of more basically for people who haven't been there before.
Yeah, I think Monterrey is a great city. It's budding in terms of like in the last decade, a lot of restaurants have come up. So in terms of nightlife and not nightlife like antros or nightclubs, but restaurants, things to do, etc. It's really come a long way in the last 10 years. Monterrey went through a very bad phase earlier in the decade of safety and drug violence, stuff like that. But it's really become much better. The city is growing in many ways. Quality of life, quality of infrastructure, etc. But it's still got a lot of deficit in transportation and many other things. In terms of life, it's a nice life. There's things to do outdoors. There's some museums, quality restaurants. So if you want to be here, have a family, have friends, etc., it's a great place. In terms of entrepreneurship, Monterrey has a lot of talent. We're close to the US, and you would expect there to be much more entrepreneurship. For me, it's really a question of why there isn't as much as you would think. And you alluded to that in the question, why after 80 entrepreneurs? And I have, like, to be honest, I have my theories, but I have no idea why. And I think my way of thinking about it is Monterrey, because we have a high quality of life, because there's a lot of traditional companies here, there's a lot of opportunities. If you have right after college a salary that pays 30,000 pesos and you're joining FEMSA or Alpha or Cemex, why risk that and start a company? You know, there's an opportunity cost, there's higher opportunity cost because there are other opportunities available. So I think that there's less of sort of the survival entrepreneurship type of thing. The entrepreneurs that are here are fantastic. Like one of the biggest e-commerce that was built 10 years ago, which was in Via Flores, is here. I don't know how much they sell, but they're a huge company. Skydrop is here. And there are some other examples of great companies and great projects. But I think that sort of availability of other opportunities is a challenge. The other thing that's a challenge is that because we have good talent, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc., they come to Monterrey every semester and do job fairs and take a lot of people to work to the United States. And that is a brain drain that it's a chicken and an egg. No? Are you paying enough here versus are there challenging projects here versus what's going on in the US? And so I think those two things combined make the availability of high-tech entrepreneurship not as prevalent here, because you see restaurants coming and going all the time. You see new stores, retail projects, buildings, etc. So there's a lot of entrepreneurship in traditional means, but maybe high-tech entrepreneurship is not as prevalent because of those two reasons I just mentioned.
Awesome. And in terms of venture capital, in Mexico, it seems like most of the venture capital is consolidated in Mexico City, but there is a strong network of angels and maybe some funds in Monterrey. What's the VC ecosystem look like?
Yeah, I think you described it perfectly. In Mexico City is where most of the activity is. From Monterrey, there's a couple of well-known funds. One is Ignia, and the other one is Dalus, ex Alta. And these two funds have been here for about 10 years, and they really kickstarted the venture investing here in Monterrey. Monterrey has a lot of family offices and a lot of angel investing, people who did really well and want to do interesting things. And in most of the cases, they still are investing in real estate, traditional real estate. Venture capital might seem too risky, might seem too new, might seem like a dream, and that's not reality or something, but they're not investing in it. However, family offices are starting to invest in Ignia, in Alta, and some even family offices from Monterrey are investing in Mexican funds like Baliv and others. I know of a couple that are doing that. But there is a lot of capital here. Some of the biggest companies in Mexico are from here. The biggest families from Mexico are from here, and so there is capital. It's just how do we unlock it and mobilize it towards high entrepreneurship? Because I was reading this morning actually the Yale Endowment report. Turns out their highest allocation asset class is venture capital. Their average return per year on venture capital in the last 20 years is 77%. I mean, if you had that information, you would be investing much more money in venture capital. Maybe the venture capital industry is very early on here because the oldest funds are 10 or 12 years old. And eventually that will pick up steam as we start to get big exits and big transactions.
So how did you decide to start Kinedu rather than any other business that you could have started after finishing off with a tech-enabled daycare platform?
Yeah, so we were building the daycare centers, and and my role there, I started as business development, and so I did a little bit of everything. In 2012, my co-founder was back, and so we started to settle down on roles that fit our, I guess, our personalities. And I was running operations and innovation essentially. And innovation that meant I was in charge of the software, but I was also in charge of customer insights and stuff like that. And so one of the things that we started to get from parents coming off our daycares after 2 or 3 years was that they were tremendously happy with what their children had learned and achieved. And most of them were constantly asking, what can I do at home? The question parents were saying is, what can I do with my children at home? Think about these parents as parents who spend 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day in the office plus the car going home. And so they're away from their children for that time. And they come home and probably have an hour or two of quality time available because their baby's about to get to sleep or they have to prepare the next day's meals, etc. And so these are parents with limited availability of time, but they wanted to be active and engaged as a parent. And so our thought was, well, why don't we provide something for them? Many daycare centers and kindergartens already give them, pieces of paper with ideas. So we said, why not build an app? 2012, Facebook had just acquired Instagram. My friend Kevin was in the news. And we said, well, let's try and build an app. And so we did. And the first thing we did was, well, if it's an app, it has to have video because, that's YouTube and everything that's popular. So we actually recorded my nephew, my brother's second son, who was 6 months old at the time. We did an early stimulation activity with him, which was about introducing scents. And we posted it on Facebook, and it took off. Like, I had no post in my life has taken off like that one. And people were like, "Oh, this is cool. How can I find more?" And so we said, "There's something here." So we went back. We actually had just received a tax return from the government of about $3,000, and we decided to record the first year of the program, 0 to 12 months, and finish up the app. And so we launched in November 2014. November 2013. November 14 of 2013. We launched that date, and in, let's say, March, we had about 50,000 downloads. I had no idea if that was good or bad. I just knew it was a lot of people who were downloading the app. And so I had a conversation with my co-founder and said, "Hey, I'm really digging this project. I think we should actually spin it off and create a new company and run this as a startup." And we basically agreed on that strategy. We went to the board and proposed that, and the board did ask some tough questions. And again, sort of based on opportunity, because they were like, "You have 10 daycare centers. You're about to open Colombia, or you just opened Colombia, actually. Why would you want to branch out with something that's just new and unproven versus managing something that already works?" But I just thought there was a lot of potential. I saw the scalability of that. It had no barriers to scale, essentially. And I decided to really try and move on and spin off this company. So we started that process in 2014. And from that point on, I started to hire a team. At that point, we had one person working on it. So she became the head of content for that at that time. She eventually left to do a master's in education at Harvard, then came back. Then we got a person for marketing. That person was the guy who was building the software for the childcare company, basically hired him to the new company. And actually the new company became the service provider for software development for the childcare company. So now Kinedu was running software for Advenio, the childcare company, and it was building its own platform. And we launched the subscription model late in 2014, a year later. And we started to sell. And so that's when the business model really started to change, because now we were thinking about unit economics, how to scale. Do we put money into Facebook or not? Do we need a bigger team? What do we outsource? So it became a real company. And while all that was happening, my co-founder and the board came to me and said, "Hey, we need some help at the childcare center. We need to fix some things that are going wrong. Can you please come back?" And I'm like, shit, okay. I basically, no questions asked, said, "Yes, I'll come back. But the only condition I have is that I will not step down from Kinedu. I will keep running both companies at the same time." And their response was like, "Are you sure you can do that?" And I'm like, I don't know, but I'll try. And so came back to Advenio as a CEO in 2015 in March or April. Then in January 2016, I thought things were going well, and I we had turned around whatever we needed to turn around. And we brought on the general manager from Colombia, which we had opened 3 years ago before, to manage and unify both countries. And so at that point, I was like, all right, now I'm finally stepping back. I'm leaving. But that dynamic had big impacts in many ways, because it really, I when I came back to Advenio, I told my 4-person team at Kinedu, I basically told them, I pointed to one of them and said, you're marketing, the other one's tech, your product. I'm going to be here 1 day a week. Do not bother me the rest of the week because I'm going to be working on this other company. And they're like, okay, cool. But it really forced the team to grow and develop skills, management skills. Like the team was amazing. And Diego, Samantha, and Christy, they've been with us for a while now, and it's just been fantastic. That was one of them. The other one was I gained like 25 to 30 pounds over a year. I just ate my stress completely, but eventually managed to tone that down and lost the weight back. That was funny. But that experience of running 2 companies was just intense. Really helped me to understand how to prioritize. And after that, 2016, I actually stepped down and I told the board of the childcare company, who were also investors in Kinedu, I was like, now we need to really spin it off. Now we need to really raise capital. And that's when we started to raise external capital for Kinedu.
What was the biggest lesson learned on prioritizing when you were running 2 companies?
Imagination is the worst enemy for priority, because you can do many things, no, and many things seem attractive because nothing's real. It's just opportunities. You have to be really focused on what are you trying to achieve and do 1, 2, 3, 4, no more tasks at hand. So even in Advenio, when I came back, I had I had Carmen, who was basically the COO, and I told her, I don't want to know anything about operations except these key metrics every week. You're going to share with me this. I'm just going to focus on sales, on the sales teams and marketing, etc. And you do operations and HR. I don't care. I don't care what you do. You have full authority. So it's a lot about delegation and being very consistent in what you want to do and what you want to focus on. Those 2 things I think are key in terms of prioritizing, making sure that they're aligned to the goal, but also delegating and letting other people focus on their own things too.
When you were raising money for a second company that had been a spin out, I think we've had at least 5 or 6 podcasts where something similar has happened. What was that conversation like with the previous investors and the new investors to get them to be comfortable with it?
So it was a very tough balancing act, because on the one hand, the previous investors, the previous company, let's really refer it like that, had put some money into the company. So they just didn't want to, they wouldn't walk. It's not fair for them to walk away. They've invested in the company and they should, have some capital. But how do you value their capital? No? And so that was a tough one. Eventually, what I did with the previous investors was start to swap some of my shares from Advenio towards a new company. And in that way, intrinsically valuing both companies at a certain amount. And so that sort of helped me earn more equity in Kinedu and help them be comfortable of A, that there's a valuation, and B, that it's that I'm not getting anything for free, but I'm actually working towards it or switching shares or something. No? So that was one part of the previous investors. And then to the next investors, we did have a conversation. We're like, well, you have an overhang of people who are not working or who are not blah, blah, blah. A typical story of having somebody in your cap table that was helpful before, but is not helpful now. And yeah, I basically said, well, this is the agreement I had with these guys. This is also my company. So I'm a co-founder in that company and I've got vested interest in, and it's also me in a way. We can't just disregard it. And so I managed to pull off the convertible notes without talking much about that, because A, I think the company Kinedu was doing well in growth and revenues, etc. But B, we didn't have a very unbalanced capital. 2018, and it's term sheet time for the Series A. What we did is that we actually distributed the shares that Advenio had in Kinedu to the actual shareholders. And so what happened there is that the shareholding of Kinedu became really diffuse. So there was no big shareholder controlling except me. I became the biggest shareholder. So that sort of normalized things. And so now we have quite a few shareholders, I guess, for our stage. Everybody's happy with what's going. And the conversation with the original investors in Advenio was, hey, this is the amount of money that you guys from the company put into Kinedu. This is what that equity is worth right now. And it really has become an up round. And so every round since then, they've appreciated their capital. So in that sense, they're happy. investors are chasing returns. As long as you give them returns, good returns, above average, something like they can be proud of as investors, I don't think there's going to be a problem in any type of conversation you have. The problem comes when you tell them, hey, I'm going to dilute you and your stock is now going to be worth zero. That's obviously not a non-starter.
If you could go back to when you first were finishing with consulting and just getting into your first startup, knowing everything you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
It takes a lot longer than you expect. That's just, your expectations look wildly off. And think about it this way, like, as you said, your trip to Latin America, well, 6-month project to a 9-year stay. For me, it was, I want to learn about entrepreneurship. I've been learning for 10 years. How much more? I feel like a fossil, like I used to stay in the university for too long. So that would be one of them. It's all about, like, manage your expectations. It takes a long time. And number two is, I think there's an advice that basically says, follow your passion. And I think that advice is fundamentally wrong. I think that people should follow their curiosity and their purpose. Eventually they'll find their passion, I think, my experience. Because if I would have gone with what I was passionate about 10 or 12 years ago, probably was going to be different things that are now. But by following my curiosity into entrepreneurship, my curiosity into education, and my curiosity into early childhood education, and eventually coming back to tech, which I've always liked, I wouldn't be where I am if I didn't follow that curiosity. And those experiences have driven how passionate I am now about early childhood. I wasn't passionate about it 10 years ago, but I am now.
What's next for you in Kinedu?
So for me, I want to grow this company more than where it is now. So I'm building a team. I've been focusing the last 2-3 months in changing the team, scaling the team, building the structure that can make us successful for the future. Kinedu is at a point where it's continuously scaling, and there's a little sort of operating machine that works, and that's going to keep improving, and we're going to keep delighting parents and giving them new activities and new features. Doing a lot of research into our data model, our assessments, our milestones, making sure that we're able to give parents the best insights into their baby's development, personalized to their own development. But one of the big projects we have for the medium term is involving the rest of the ecosystem, the rest of the adults in a child's life ecosystem. That involves caregivers, that involves teachers, daycare centers, pediatricians, etc. So you probably start to see a push around Kinedu giving teachers tools to personalize learning, giving doctors tools to assess or to understand or to connect with parents better, etc. I think that's the next 3 to 5 years, just a huge focus on this whole ecosystem and how our model can be used for good, for research, and can move the field of early childhood forward.
Well, I'm looking forward to see how you guys execute on that, because early childhood education is a super important thing, especially in places where maybe they don't have the best early childcare. So if people are using your platform to be able to teach their kids even more and have better time with family, it's awesome. So looking forward to see how you guys scale, and we can definitely do a follow-up sometime, maybe a year from now, and see how things are going.
I would love that, Nathan. Thank you so much for your time. Can I ask you one final question?
Sure.
How did you find out about Kinedu?
I think that you were recommended by an entrepreneur in common. I'll have to look back and see, because it was a while back. Awesome. And we finally got it on the schedule. But yeah, I think
awesome.
I think that's what it was.
It's been great speaking to you. So thank you for the questions and the opportunity to talk about the company.
No, of course, it was great. Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with my guest, Luis Garza, founder of Kinedu. If you like the podcast, please share it with a friend and give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks to Angel, Sofia, and Josefina for helping produce this podcast and writing the show notes. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day.